The rugged mountains of Wyoming Territory cast long shadows across the valley as the afternoon sun began its descent. Autumn winds swept through the tall prairie grass, creating waves of golden movement that stretched toward the horizon. Nestled at the base of the foothills sat the Raven Creek Ranch, its weathered buildings standing defiant against time and elements alike. Mason Blackwood stood on his porch, his scarred face partially hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat as he surveyed his land. The right side of his face was a roadmap of pain, burn scars stretching from his jawline up past his temple, pulling at the corner of his eye and twisting his once handsome features into something that made children gasp and women avert their eyes. His ranch hands kept their distance, working his land but rarely engaging in conversation beyond what was necessary. The isolation had become as much a part of him as the scars themselves. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel. We'd love to know what city you're watching from. Mason folded the letter in his rough hands, calloused from years of working the harsh Wyoming range. The stagecoach was due in Raven Creek tomorrow, bringing with it Charlotte Bennett, his mail-order bride from Boston, a woman who had only seen a daguerreotype of his face before the fire, before the war, before everything changed. He had been honest in his letters about his circumstances. A successful ranch, good land, steady income, but had merely mentioned an injury that left him changed. Some nights he wondered if his omission bordered on deception. But the loneliness of the last 8 years had finally broken his resolve. Even Mason Blackwood couldn't fight the human need for companionship forever. The ranch house, with its empty rooms and silent halls, had become a constant reminder of everything he lacked. He had wealth, land, respect as a businessman, but not a single soul who looked at him without pity or revulsion. Inside the house, Eliza Hawkins bustled about the kitchen, the only person in Raven Creek who treated Mason with normalcy. The older woman had been his housekeeper since before the fire and had witnessed his descent into isolation. "She's coming tomorrow, then?" Eliza asked, setting a plate of stew before him. Mason nodded, his good eye fixed on the steaming food. "Well, I've prepared the east bedroom for her. Fresh linens, flowers from the garden. It's as welcoming as I could make it." Mason thanked her quietly, knowing that no amount of flowers could prepare Charlotte Bennett for the reality of his appearance. Eliza hesitated before adding, "She might surprise you, Mr. Blackwood. Not everyone sees with the same eyes as the fools in town." That night, Mason stood before the mirror in his bedroom, something he rarely did. The lamplight cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the rippled skin, the permanently narrowed eye, the twisted corner of his mouth. The left side remained untouched, a cruel reminder of the man he had been. At 45, his dark hair had begun to silver at the temples, and deep lines had formed around his eyes and mouth from years of squinting against the harsh Wyoming sun. The contrast between the unmarred left side and the ravaged right made the scars all the more shocking. He touched the damaged skin, feeling the uneven texture beneath his fingertips. Would she scream? Run? Politely ask to return east on the next stage? He had made arrangements with the bank to ensure she could return to Boston if she wished, with enough money to establish herself. Mason Blackwood might be many things, but he wouldn't trap a woman in a nightmare. The town of Raven Creek sat nestled in the valley, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single dusty main street. Though modest, it served as the commercial hub for ranchers and farmers scattered across the surrounding countryside. Mason rarely ventured into town, sending ranch hands to collect supplies and conduct necessary business. The few times he did appear, conversations halted, mothers pulled children closer, and men nodded stiffly in acknowledgement of his position rather than out of any genuine respect. Only Sheriff James Callahan and Doc Miller treated him with anything approaching normalcy, a courtesy extended from their shared experiences during the war. At the general store, Mason's rare appearances caused an immediate hush as customers found sudden interest in merchandise far from where he stood. Dawn broke cold and clear over the mountains as Mason readied himself for the journey into town. He chose his newest shirt, a dark blue that Eliza claimed brought out his eyes, and his least worn coat. Such vanity seemed pointless given what awaited Charlotte Bennett when he removed his hat. But some stubborn part of him still clung to propriety. The leather patch he sometimes wore in town remained on his dresser. He wouldn't hide behind it today. If Charlotte was to be his wife, she would see him as he was from the first moment. His foreman, Thomas Sullivan, had offered to retrieve Charlotte from the stage, but Mason had declined. This was his responsibility, his choice, and he would face the consequences with the same stoic resolve that had carried him through the war and the lonely years that followed. The journey into Raven Creek seemed shorter than usual, the familiar landscape blurring as Mason's mind filled with rehearsed greetings and explanations. The main street was busy with morning commerce, shopkeepers sweeping porches, freight wagons delivering goods, cowboys emerging bleary-eyed from the saloon after a night of cards. Mason tied his horse outside the stagecoach office, ignoring the sudden silence that fell across the street. Sheriff Callahan emerged from his office, crossing to where Mason stood. "Morning, Blackwood," he said, offering his hand. Mason shook it, grateful for the small normalcy. "Your Boston lady arrives today, I hear." News traveled faster than telegrams in Raven Creek. "She does," Mason confirmed, his voice rough from disuse. Callahan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Hope it works out for you." Inside the stagecoach office, the clerk avoided meeting Mason's gaze directly. A courtesy of sorts, Mason supposed, though it had long since ceased to feel like one. "Stage is running on time today, Mr. Blackwood. Should be here within the hour." Mason nodded his thanks and stepped back outside, unwilling to endure the confined space and its stifling atmosphere of discomfort. Instead, he stood beneath the awning, watching the street, while townspeople watched him from the corners of their eyes. Children pointed until their mothers hushed them with sharp whispers. Mason had long ago learned to pretend not to notice, though each small reaction cut in its own way. He wondered what Charlotte had been told about Raven Creek and its scarred rancher. Had rumors already poisoned her mind, or would the shock come solely from seeing him in person? The distant sound of hoofbeats and the rattling of wheels announced the stage's arrival before the cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Mason straightened his shoulders and adjusted his hat, though he resisted the impulse to pull it lower over his face. The stagecoach rolled down the main street, drawing the attention of everyone in town. Or perhaps it was the combination of the stage and Mason Blackwood's rare presence that caused shopkeepers to pause and saloon girls to peer through windows. The coach came to a stop before the office, the driver setting the brake with a practiced motion. Mason stood motionless, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt since charging into battle at Gettysburg. The door opened, and the driver assisted the first passenger, an elderly man who glanced at Mason and quickly looked away. And then she appeared in the doorway of the stagecoach, one gloved hand accepting the driver's assistance. Charlotte Bennett stepped down onto Wyoming soil, her blue traveling dress dusty from the journey, but otherwise impeccable. She was younger than Mason had expected, perhaps 30 to his 45, with chestnut hair partially visible beneath her hat, and eyes that matched the clear mountain sky. She stood straight-backed, despite what must have been a grueling journey, surveying the town with curious attention rather than the disappointment he had anticipated. When her gaze finally fell on Mason, he resisted the urge to turn the scarred side of his face away. Instead, he removed his hat and stepped forward, exposing himself fully to her scrutiny. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm Mason Blackwood." The moment stretched between them, filled with the background noise of the town and the pounding of Mason's heart in his ears. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly as they traveled across his face, lingering on the scarred tissue before returning to meet his gaze. Mason waited for the flinch, the polite mask of horror, the immediate regret. He had seen all these reactions before, but Charlotte Bennett surprised him. Her expression shifted from shock to something more complex, but she didn't look away. Instead, she extended her hand. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her Boston accent crisp against the frontier backdrop. "Thank you for meeting me. The journey was quite educational." Her hand remained steady as Mason enfolded it in his own larger one. Around them, the town of Raven Creek collectively held its breath, waiting for the drama to unfold. Whispers erupted along the boardwalk as Mason helped Charlotte collect her luggage, 2 modest trunks that contained her entire life from Boston. The stagecoach driver handed them down, sneaking glances at Charlotte, as if expecting her to bolt at any moment. Mason loaded the trunks into his wagon, while Charlotte thanked the driver for his assistance during the journey. Her composure remained intact, despite the stares and whispers that followed them down the main street. Mason assisted her onto the wagon seat, acutely aware of every eye in Raven Creek fixed upon them. As he rounded the wagon to climb up himself, he heard Wilna Peterson's carrying whisper to Hannah Wells outside the Mercantile. Poor thing, probably didn't know what she was getting into. Give her a week before she's begging for passage back east. The journey from town to the ranch passed in relative silence, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels punctuated only by Mason's occasional comments about landmarks or boundaries of his property. Charlotte sat beside him, her back straight, gloved hands folded in her lap, taking in the vast Wyoming landscape with unreadable expressions. The mountains rose before them, their pine-covered slopes dark against the blue sky. "Your letters didn't do justice to the beauty of this country," Charlotte finally said as they crested a hill that revealed the full expanse of Mason's ranch spread out below them. The main house stood proud amid a collection of outbuildings, corrals, and barns. Cattle dotted the distant pastures like scattered chess pieces on a board of green and gold. Mason felt a surge of pride despite his apprehension. Whatever Charlotte thought of him, she couldn't deny the success he had built from nothing. As they approached the ranch house, ranch hands paused in their work to watch the wagon's arrival. Mason felt Charlotte stiffen slightly beside him, undoubtedly noting the curious and pitying glances directed her way. He had warned the men to be respectful, but he couldn't control their thoughts or the looks in their eyes. Eliza Hawkins stood waiting on the porch, her weather-worn face breaking into a welcoming smile as Mason helped Charlotte down from the wagon. "Miss Bennett, welcome to Raven Creek Ranch," Eliza said, stepping forward to take Charlotte's hands in her own. I'm Eliza Hawkins, the housekeeper. It's a blessing to finally have another woman about the place." Charlotte returned Eliza's smile with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins. I'm grateful for the welcome." Mason carried Charlotte's trunks to the east bedroom, while Eliza showed her around the main floor of the house. He placed the luggage at the foot of the bed, then stood awkwardly in the center of the room, surveying it through a stranger's eyes. The furniture was quality but plain, the curtains serviceable rather than decorative. He had instructed Eliza to make it comfortable, but now he wondered if he should have done more. Would Charlotte find it hopelessly provincial after Boston? The sound of women's voices approached down the hallway, and Mason moved toward the door, unwilling to be caught lingering in her private space. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, Eliza beside her. "Your room seems satisfactory, Miss Bennet," he asked formally. Charlotte nodded, her eyes meeting his directly. "It's lovely, Mr. Blackwood. Mrs. Hawkins has made it very welcoming." Dinner that evening was a quiet affair, with Eliza serving before discreetly withdrawing to her own quarters, attached to the kitchen. Mason and Charlotte sat at opposite ends of the long oak table, the distance between them filled with the gentle clink of silverware against china and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Mason struggled to remember the art of conversation, to recall what one discussed with a woman who had traveled thousands of miles to marry a stranger. "I hope the journey wasn't too arduous," he finally said, cutting into the roast beef on his plate. Charlotte dabbed her lips with a napkin before responding. "It was educational. I've never seen such vast open spaces. It makes Boston seem quite cramped by comparison." She hesitated before adding, "Your letters prepared me somewhat, but I don't think one can truly comprehend the scale of the West until seeing it firsthand." After dinner, they moved to the parlor, where an uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Mason found the courage to address what they had both been avoiding. "Miss Bennet," he began, standing before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, the scarred side of his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "I feel I must apologize for not being more forthcoming about the extent of my injuries. I mention them in my letters, but words inadequately describe." He gestured vaguely toward his face. Charlotte set her teacup down with deliberate care. "Mr. Blackwood, you did mention you were scarred in a fire. I admit the reality is more severe than I imagined, but I'm not a child to be frightened by appearances." Her directness startled him. Most people in Raven Creek pretended his scars didn't exist, while simultaneously seeing nothing else. "Nevertheless," Mason continued, "I understand if you wish to return to Boston. I've made arrangements with the bank. You would have sufficient funds to establish yourself comfortably." He kept his voice even, businesslike, as if discussing a cattle transaction rather than the dissolution of their arrangement before it had properly begun. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "That's very considerate, Mr. Blackwood, but I didn't travel all this way to turn back at the first challenge." She smoothed her skirts, a gesture that seemed more for composure than necessity. "In my experience, it's rarely the visible scars that determine a person's character. I prefer to make my decisions based on more substantial evidence than appearance." The next morning brought a tentative new routine to the Raven Creek Ranch. Charlotte emerged for breakfast, dressed practically in a simple blue dress, her hair neatly arranged, but without the elaborate styling Mason had observed in the few Eastern women who had passed through Raven Creek. She ate with healthy appetite, asked intelligent questions about the ranch operations, and expressed interest in establishing a kitchen garden with Eliza's help. Mason found himself simultaneously relieved by her practical nature and mystified by her apparent acceptance of her situation. As he prepared to leave for his daily inspection of the ranch, Charlotte accompanied him to the door. "Will you show me the ranch properly when you have time, Mr. Blackwood? I'd like to understand my new home." The days stretched into a week, and the tentative rhythm between them began to find its footing. Charlotte adapted to ranch life with surprising ease, helping Eliza with household tasks while adding her own touches to the once Spartan home. Mason discovered small changes: cushions on the hard wooden chairs, wildflowers in jars on the dining table, curtains rehemmed to let in more light. Charlotte spent hours on the porch, sketching the mountains in a leather-bound book or reading from the modest library Mason had accumulated over the years. The ranch hands grew accustomed to her presence, tipping their hats respectfully when she appeared in the yard. Even Thomas Sullivan, Mason's taciturn foreman, seemed to soften in her presence, answering her questions about cattle breeding with unexpected patience. On Sunday, Charlotte emerged from her room dressed for church, a prospect that filled Mason with dread. He hadn't attended services in Raven Creek since returning from the war, unwilling to endure the stares and whispers in a place meant for community and acceptance. "I don't attend church, Miss Bennet," he said stiffly. Charlotte adjusted her hat in the hallway mirror. "I assumed as much. Would you object to my going? Mrs. Hawkins mentioned she could accompany me." Her tone held no judgment, merely inquiry. Mason hesitated, torn between concern for how she would be received and reluctance to restrict her movements. The people of Raven Creek can be unkind in their curiosity. They will ask questions about our arrangement. Charlotte turned to face him fully. "Let them ask. I've never found gossip particularly intimidating, Mr. Blackwood." Reports of Charlotte's church attendance reached Mason before she returned to the ranch. Thomas Sullivan mentioned casually that Miss Bennet had caused quite a stir by introducing herself confidently as the future Mrs. Blackwood and thanking everyone for their warm welcome to Raven Creek, a welcome that had been notably absent. She had sat with Eliza in a pew near the front, sung hymns in a clear, pleasant voice, and accepted Reverend Parker's invitation to join the Ladies' Aid Society with gracious enthusiasm. By the time Charlotte returned, driven by an unusually talkative Eliza, Mason had retreated to his study, uncertain how to process this development. Their arrangement had been practical: companionship and security exchanged between two adults with clear-eyed understanding. He hadn't expected Charlotte Bennet to embrace the fiction of their engagement with such apparent conviction. That evening, Mason found Charlotte on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. He settled into the chair beside her, the wood creaking beneath his weight. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence before Mason found the courage to ask what had been bothering him all day. "Why did you tell the townspeople you were the future Mrs. Blackwood? Our arrangement doesn't require such—" He searched for the right word. "Commitment." Charlotte kept her eyes on the distant mountains. "Would you prefer I'd introduced myself as your mail-order bride, or perhaps explained the practical nature of our arrangement to the good people of Raven Creek?" There was no bite in her words, only gentle challenge. Mason shifted uncomfortably. "Of course not. But—" "Mr. Blackwood," Charlotte interrupted, turning to face him fully, "I came here with the understanding that we would marry. Has that changed?" Mason struggled to read her expression in the fading light. "No, but I assumed after seeing how people react to me, you might reconsider." Charlotte's laugh surprised him, short and genuine. "Do you think I'm unaware of how people see you? The stares in town, The whispers behind hands? The way the ranch hands avoid looking directly at you? She shook her head. I'm not blind, Mr. Blackwood, nor am I naive. But neither am I so shallow that a man's scars would outweigh his character. She gestured toward the ranch spread out before them. You've built something remarkable here. You treat your workers fairly. You've been nothing but respectful to me, and Mrs. Hawkins speaks of you with genuine affection. Those facts interest me far more than the state of your face. The following Tuesday brought unexpected visitors to Raven Creek Ranch. Charlotte was hanging laundry with Eliza when the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the drive. Sheriff Callahan rode at the front, accompanied by 3 well-dressed men whose stiff posture and Eastern attire marked them as outsiders. Mason emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he moved to intercept the visitors. Charlotte couldn't hear the exchange, but she observed Mason's body language shift from casual inquiry to rigid formality. After a brief conversation, Mason led the men toward the house. Charlotte hurriedly removed her apron as Eliza whispered, "Those are the men from the railroad company. They've been trying to buy land all through the valley." Mason's face was unreadable as he approached, but tension radiated from his shoulders. "Miss Bennett, this is Sheriff Callahan and representatives from the Western Pacific Railroad. Gentlemen, my fiancée, Miss Charlotte Bennett." The men were invited into the parlor, where Eliza served coffee, while Charlotte sat quietly beside Mason, observing the interaction. The railroad representatives spoke of progress, of connecting communities, of bringing civilization to the frontier. Their offer for Mason's land was substantial, more than double its market value, but would require surrendering the water rights to Raven Creek itself, the lifeblood of the ranch. "Your ranch sits at a critical juncture, Mr. Blackwood," explained Mr. Harrington, the senior representative. "Without this parcel, we'll need to reroute around the entire valley, adding months to construction and considerable expense." Mason listened impassively, his scarred face giving away nothing of his thoughts. When Charlotte offered to refill coffee cups, Mr. Harrington's young associate flinched visibly as Mason turned to thank her, his scars fully visible in the afternoon light. After the visitors departed, Mason stood on the porch, watching the dust cloud of their departure fade into the distance. Charlotte joined him, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "They want more than just land for the tracks," she observed quietly. Mason nodded, his jaw tight. "They want Raven Creek itself. Without the water, the rest of the ranch becomes worthless for cattle." He turned to face her, his expression grave. "I built this place from nothing, Miss Bennett. After the war, when everyone thought the scarred captain should hide himself away, I came west and made something that would outlast me." His hands gripped the porch railing, knuckles white with tension. "I won't surrender it to become another Eastern investor's profit margin." Charlotte placed her hand lightly on his arm. "Then don't." The railroad men's visit catalyzed a shift in Raven Creek's attitude toward Mason, and by extension, Charlotte. Rumors spread that Mason had refused a fortune for his land, placing his own stubbornness above the town's prosperity. The Western Pacific promised economic growth, jobs, and connection to the outside world, benefits that appealed to struggling shopkeepers and farmers. When Charlotte visited the general store the following week, the friendly welcome she'd received after church had cooled considerably. Mrs. Peterson handed over her packages with bare civility, while Hannah Wells pretended not to see her on the boardwalk. Only Reverend Parker maintained his warmth, thanking her for the pies she'd contributed to the church supper and inquiring after her comfort at the ranch. Sheriff Callahan rode out to the ranch the following Sunday afternoon, finding Mason in the barn repairing tack. Thought you should know, Blackwood. There's talk in town, the sheriff said without preamble. Mason continued his work, the needle pushing through thick leather with practiced precision. There's always talk in town, James. Callahan removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. This is different. The railroad men have been buying drinks at the Golden Spur, talking about progress and prosperity. Some folks are saying your refusal is holding back the whole territory. Mason tied off his stitch before looking up. And you, Sheriff, what do you say? Callahan sighed. I say a man has a right to his own property. But I also say you should watch your back. Railroad men play rough when they don't get their way. That evening, Mason shared the sheriff's warning with Charlotte as they sat before the fire. Perhaps you should return to town with Eliza for a few days, he suggested, his voice carefully neutral. If there's trouble coming, I'd prefer you were elsewhere. Charlotte set aside her mending, studying him with those direct blue eyes that never seemed to flinch from his scars. Is that what you truly want, Mr. Blackwood? To face this alone? Mason shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. What I want is irrelevant. Your safety— Charlotte interrupted him with a wave of her hand. My safety is no more important than yours or anyone else's on this ranch. I didn't come west to hide at the first sign of difficulty. She picked up her mending again, her stitches neat and precise. Besides, I suspect sending the women away is exactly what these railroad men would expect. Sometimes, unexpected behavior is the strongest position. 3 days later, Mason returned from the north pasture to find 2 of his fences cut and a dozen head of cattle missing. Thomas Sullivan and the ranch hands spent hours tracking the scattered animals, eventually recovering all but 3. The cuts in the fence were clean and deliberate, the work of someone sending a message rather than simple vandalism. That night, Mason checked his rifle and pistol before placing them near his bed, a wartime habit he had abandoned years ago. As he made his final rounds of the house, he found Charlotte in the kitchen, rolling dough with focused intensity. Couldn't sleep, she explained without looking up, flour dusting her forearms and a stray lock of hair that had escaped its pins. Baking helps me think. Mason leaned against the doorframe, watching her capable hands shape the dough. And what are you thinking about at this hour, Miss Bennett? Charlotte paused, brushing hair from her forehead with the back of one wrist. I'm thinking that people who resort to cutting fences in the night are cowards, she said matter-of-factly. And I'm thinking that cowards can be outlasted by those with stronger convictions. She resumed her kneading, the rhythmic motion oddly hypnotic in the lamplight. I'm also thinking that perhaps it's time you started calling me Charlotte, Mr. Blackwood. Miss Bennett seems overly formal for 2 people facing fence cutters together. The request, so simple, so ordinary, caught Mason off guard. It had been years since he had used a woman's given name in conversation. Years since anyone but Eliza had spoken to him with such easy familiarity. Charlotte, he said, testing the name on his tongue. Then you must call me Mason. She smiled without looking up. Mason, she repeated, and somehow the exchange felt more intimate than any they had shared before. The following week brought escalation. A small storage shed near the southern boundary of the property was found burning in the early hours of the morning. The ranch hands formed a bucket line from the nearby creek, managing to save the adjacent structures, but not the shed itself. Mason surveyed the smoking ruins, his face grim in the gray dawn light. Thomas Sullivan stood beside him, hat in hand. It was deliberate, boss, the foreman said quietly. Found a broken lantern with the wick still soaked in coal oil. Mason nodded, unsurprised. Double the night patrols. No one rides alone, not even to check the herds. Sullivan hesitated before adding, "The men are with you, Mr. Blackwood. Every one of them turned down offers to work for the railroad at double wages." Mason looked at his foreman with surprise. "They've been approaching my men?" Sullivan nodded. "Started right after their visit. Not a man took the bait. Word of the fire spread quickly to town, carried by one of the ranch hands sent for supplies. By midday, Reverend Parker arrived at the ranch, his aging mare lathered from the unusual exertion. The minister found Mason and Charlotte inspecting the burned shed, making inventory of lost tools and supplies. "This has gone far enough," Parker said without greeting, dismounting stiffly. "Using fear and destruction against a man protecting his livelihood. It's unconscionable." Mason shook the minister's hand, genuinely touched by the show of support. "I appreciate your coming all this way, Reverend, but I don't want you caught in the middle of this." Parker waved away the concern. "That's precisely where a minister belongs, Mr. Blackwood, between right and wrong." He turned to Charlotte, his expression softening. "Miss Bennett, I've brought letters from the Ladies' Aid Society. Not everyone in town supports these railroad tactics." The letters, nearly a dozen of them, contained expressions of support, offers of assistance, and surprisingly personal notes from women who had barely acknowledged Charlotte in town. She read them at the kitchen table, tears occasionally welling in her eyes. Mason watched from the doorway, uncertain how to respond to her emotion. "They're ashamed," Charlotte explained, noticing his confusion. "They've treated you abominably for years because of scars you couldn't help. And now they're ashamed because they see true ugliness in the railroad men's actions." She gathered the letters carefully. Mrs. Peterson writes that her husband lost an arm at Shiloh, but was always welcomed home. She says the town's treatment of you has been hypocritical. Mason shifted uncomfortably at this unexpected alliance. He had long ago accepted Raven Creek's attitude toward his scars as immutable, like the weather or the seasons, something to be endured rather than changed. That night, Charlotte found Mason in his study, poring over land maps spread across his desk. She knocked lightly on the open door, and he looked up, momentarily disoriented from concentration. "I've been thinking," she said, entering with 2 cups of coffee. "The railroad needs your land because of Raven Creek itself. Correct?" Mason nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The water rights are crucial for their steam engines. Without a reliable water source, they can't run a major depot where they've planned it." Charlotte settled into the chair across from his desk. "But there's another creek that runs through the Johnson property to the west, isn't there? I noticed it on our ride last week." Mason stared at her, then hurriedly consulted his maps. "Blacktail Creek," he confirmed. "It's smaller, but consistent year-round. Old Johnson's been trying to sell that parcel for years." The plan took shape over the next 2 days. Mason rode to town with Thomas Sullivan, meeting with Sheriff Callahan and Reverend Parker in the back room of the bank. By the time the stage arrived from Cheyenne 3 days later, everything was arranged. The Western Pacific representatives returned to Raven Creek, confident that increased pressure had softened Mason's resolve. They were surprised to be invited to the ranch for a formal discussion, even more surprised to find a contract already drawn up, not for Mason's land, but for a partnership that would route the railroad along Blacktail Creek, with water rights secured through an agreement with Old Johnson. The depot would still be built, the town would still prosper, but Raven Creek Ranch would remain intact, providing beef for railroad workers and passengers at negotiated rates. Mr. Prescott, Harrington's initial outrage gave way to calculating consideration as he reviewed the alternative plans. This route would add expense, he protested, but with notably less conviction than before. Mason remained impassive. Less expense than fighting the entire valley, he replied evenly. Word travels fast among ranchers, Mr. Harrington. Since your men started cutting fences and burning buildings, I've had visitors from 3 counties offering support. This was stretching the truth considerably. Only 2 neighboring ranchers had actually visited, but the bluff hit its mark. Harrington's younger associate shifted nervously. Perhaps we should consider Mr. Blackwood's proposal, sir. The board is expecting progress, not prolonged conflict. Charlotte, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, offered fresh coffee with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what leverage they held. The departure of the railroad men, this time with a preliminary agreement that would preserve both Raven Creek Ranch and the town's economic future, marked a turning point. Word spread quickly through town, and by Sunday's church service, Charlotte and Mason were greeted with genuine warmth. Mason had agreed to attend his first church service in Raven Creek since before the war. He sat stiffly in the pew, acutely aware of the glances directed his way, but these held a different quality than before: respect rather than revulsion, admiration rather than pity. Reverend Parker's sermon on judging not by appearance but by character was perhaps overly pointed, but Mason endured it with stoic dignity, Charlotte's hand occasionally brushing his in silent support. The invitation to dinner at Sheriff Callahan's home the following week would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Mason and Charlotte arrived to find several prominent townspeople already gathered, including the banker and his wife, the doctor, and Reverend Parker. The initial awkwardness gave way to genuine conversation as the evening progressed. Mason found himself discussing cattle prices with men who had previously conducted business with him only through intermediaries. Charlotte charmed the women with stories of Boston society, while tactfully steering conversation away from overly personal questions about their relationship. By the time they departed, something fundamental had shifted in Mason's relationship with the town he had existed alongside, but never truly been part of for 8 long years. Autumn deepened toward winter, painting the mountains with the fiery colors of changing aspens before the first snows dusted the highest peaks. Charlotte and Mason settled into a companionable routine, their formal addresses long since abandoned for given names. Each day brought small discoveries: Charlotte's unexpected skill with horses, Mason's dry humor that emerged more frequently as his comfort with her grew, shared preferences for coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, as Mason put it. The wedding date was set for the first week of December, a practical decision given the approaching winter, though neither mentioned this rationale when announcing it. Eliza Hawkins bustled about the house with renewed energy, assisted by a rotating cast of ladies from town, eager to help with wedding preparations and, Mason suspected, to satisfy their curiosity about the reformed recluse and his Eastern bride. The night before their wedding, Mason found Charlotte in the parlor, a half-finished piece of embroidery in her lap, but her attention on the fire dancing in the hearth. He hesitated in the doorway, suddenly uncertain of his welcome, despite the months of growing closeness between them. Charlotte looked up, smiling as she set aside her work. "I was just thinking about the first time I saw this room," she said, patting the sofa beside her in invitation. Mason sat, leaving a careful space between them. "It must have seemed terribly plain after Boston." Charlotte shook her head. "It seemed honest, like you." She turned to face him fully. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night? That you understood if I wished to return to Boston? Mason nodded, remembering the formal man he had been. So certain of rejection that he had offered escape before they had truly begun. I meant it, he said quietly. I would never have forced you to stay. Charlotte reached across the space between them, her hand covering his. I know. That's why I stayed. Her fingers were warm against his skin, the simple touch bridging months of careful distance. Tomorrow, I'll make vows before God and the people of Raven Creek, but I want you to hear this privately first. Her eyes held his, unflinching as always when looking at his scarred face. I choose you, Mason Blackwood, not from necessity or practicality or lack of options, but because in you I found a man of integrity and surprising gentleness. A man who built something meaningful from pain. A man I have come to respect and, yes, to love. The word hung between them, love, unexpected and transformative. Mason had resigned himself to a marriage of companionship and mutual respect, had convinced himself that asking for more would be greedy beyond measure. Yet here was this remarkable woman offering what he had never dared hope for. Charlotte, he began, his voice rough with emotion, I am not a man who finds words easily. The war and the fire took more than just my face. They took my belief that there could be a place for me among normal people, a family, a true home. He turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers interlacing. You have given that back to me, piece by piece. I cannot promise to be an easy man to love. I have lived too long in solitude for that. But I can promise that no man will ever cherish you more completely or protect what we build together more fiercely. Their wedding day dawned, clear and cold, the mountains etched sharply against a sky of perfect blue. The small church in Raven Creek overflowed with guests, ranch hands in awkwardly pressed shirts, townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid Mason, neighboring ranchers who had rallied against the railroad's tactics. Charlotte wore a dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, a practical choice that suited her perfectly. Mason stood at the altar, the left side of his face toward the congregation, as had been his habit for years, until Charlotte quietly took his arm and turned him fully toward their guests, a silent statement that neither of them would hide any longer. When Reverend Parker invited Mason to kiss his bride, he did so without hesitation or shame, his scarred face meeting her smooth one in a gentle promise before the entire community. The celebration afterward at Raven Creek Ranch lasted well into the evening, with tables set up in the barn cleared for dancing. Mason watched from the sidelines as Charlotte taught Thomas Sullivan's youngest son the steps to a Virginia reel, her face flushed with exertion and happiness. Sheriff Callahan appeared at Mason's side, offering a glass of whiskey. Never thought I'd see Raven Creek turn out like this for you, Blackwood, he commented, nodding toward the crowded barn where ranch hands and townspeople mingled freely. Mason accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. Neither did I. The two men stood in companionable silence until Charlotte approached, slightly breathless from dancing. Your turn, husband, she said, extending her hand. Mason shook his head. I don't dance, Charlotte. Not since the fire? Mason looked for him when he hesitated. Another thing to reclaim, then. Her hand remained extended, patient but insistent. Behind them, Callahan chuckled softly. Might as well surrender with dignity, Blackwood. Seems to me that's a battle you've already lost. Mason looked from Charlotte's determined face to the crowded dance floor, where remarkably, no one seemed to be paying particular attention to them. For the first time in years, he was just another man at a gathering. Not the scarred recluse to be avoided or pitied. He set down his glass and took Charlotte's hand. I may step on your toes, he warned. Charlotte's smile illuminated her face. I'm stronger than I look, Mason Blackwood. I suspect I can bear it. In the years that followed, Raven Creek Ranch prospered alongside the town that had grown with the coming of the railroad. The depot brought new settlers, new businesses, and new opportunities that transformed the once isolated community. Mason and Charlotte expanded the ranch, adding new pastures and modernizing the main house with comforts that blended Eastern refinement with Western practicality. The birth of their son, James, followed by daughter Elizabeth 2 years later, completed the family neither had expected to find. Mason's scars remained, of course, permanent reminders of the fire that had nearly destroyed him. But they had faded in significance, becoming just one aspect of a man now known for his fair dealings, quiet strength, and occasional wry humor, rather than his disfigurement. On cool autumn evenings, Mason often found himself on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in colors no Eastern artist could capture. Charlotte would join him when the children were asleep, her head resting against his shoulder as they shared the peaceful moment. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked one such evening, nearly 5 years after she had stepped from the stagecoach into his life. "Coming west to marry a stranger?" Charlotte's laugh was soft in the gathering dusk. "Not for a moment," she said, turning to face the man whose scarred face had become more dear to her than any other sight in the world. "Though you should know by now, Mason Blackwood, that you've never been a stranger to me. From that first day, I saw exactly who you were." She reached up to trace the uneven texture of his right cheek, a gesture that had become an intimate ritual between them. "Don't be afraid of me," she whispered, echoing words she had spoken on their wedding night. "I see you, all of you, and I love what I see." From the house behind them came the sound of James calling for his mother, his young voice still carrying traces of babyhood despite his 4 years. Charlotte pressed a kiss to Mason's cheek before rising to attend their son. Mason remained on the porch, watching the first stars appear above the mountains that had witnessed his journey from scarred recluse to husband, father, and respected community member. The night breeze carried the scent of pine and sage, the essence of the land that had given him a second chance at life. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the evening express from Cheyenne, a reminder of challenges faced and overcome. Mason Blackwood smiled in the darkness, a man at peace with both his scars and his blessings, surrounded by the home and family he had never dared to dream might be his.